The cameras fell silent as Captain Lorenzo Bianchi stepped forward, breaking formation. 500 years of unwavering Swiss Guard protocol shattered in an instant. His ceremonial halberd dropped to the marble floor with a haunting echo that reverberated through St. Peter's Basilica. The other guards remained frozen, eyes forward, as Lorenzo approached the Pope's casket. With trembling hands, he removed his distinctive blue, red, and yellow helmet, something strictly forbidden during duty, and placed it gently atop the papal casket. Tears streaming down his face, he pressed his forehead against the cold wood and whispered words no microphone could capture. Cardinal Rossi moved to intervene but stopped, recognizing something profound was unfolding. The entire Vatican held its breath. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of profound human moments and historical significance, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The story of Lorenzo Bianchi's unprecedented breach of protocol during Pope Benedict XVII's funeral begins long before that fateful day in St. Peter's Square. 22 years earlier, a young boy from Lucerne, Switzerland stood wide-eyed beside his father outside the Vatican walls. Lorenzo was just 7 years old, but already transfixed by the stoic figures in their Renaissance-inspired uniforms. His father, Marco Bianchi, himself a former Swiss Guard who had served under Pope John Paul II, squeezed his son's shoulder. "One day, perhaps you too will serve, Lorenzo," he said, his voice carrying both pride and caution. "But remember, to be chosen for the Pontifical Swiss Guard means your first loyalty is to God, then to the Holy Father, and only then to yourself. It is not glory we seek, but service in silence." That night, in their modest hotel room, Lorenzo couldn't sleep. While his father snored softly in the adjacent bed, the boy stood at the window, gazing at the dome of St. Peter's illuminated against the night sky. He practiced standing at attention until his small legs ached, imagining himself among the elite protectors of the Pope. By age 19, Lorenzo had fulfilled all the stringent requirements to apply for the Swiss Guard. A devout Catholic, unmarried, standing over 174 centimeters tall, and having completed his mandatory Swiss military service with exemplary records. He was among the handful of applicants accepted that year. His father, now battling the early stages of Parkinson's disease, had wept with pride when Lorenzo received his acceptance letter. "Remember," Marco had told him, his hands trembling slightly as he straightened his son's tie before departure. "The uniform you wear has remained almost unchanged since the 1500s. When you put it on, you carry centuries of tradition. Never forget that." On May 6, 2007, Lorenzo took his solemn oath in the San Damaso courtyard, swearing to protect the Pope with his life if necessary. It was during this ceremony that he first encountered Cardinal Joseph Albin, who would later become Pope Benedict XVII. The cardinal had approached the new recruits, taking time to speak with each of them personally. When he reached Lorenzo, something unexpected happened. Rather than the perfunctory blessing Lorenzo had witnessed with the others, Cardinal Albin paused, studying the young man's face. "You have your father's eyes," the cardinal said softly. "Marco Bianchi was one of the finest guards I have known. He once intercepted a man who tried to approach Pope John Paul II with concealed scissors during a general audience. Did he ever tell you?" Lorenzo shook his head, stunned that the cardinal would know his father, let alone such a detail. "Your father never sought recognition," Cardinal Albin continued. "That is the mark of true service. Remember that, young Bianchi." This brief exchange marked the beginning of what would become an unusual relationship between Lorenzo and the man who would eventually ascend to the papacy. While always maintaining appropriate formality, Cardinal Albin, and later Pope Benedict XVII after his election in 2011, seemed to take a special interest in Lorenzo's development within the Guard. As Lorenzo rose through the ranks from halberdier to corporal, then vice-corporal to sergeant, he occasionally found himself assigned to direct detail for the Pope. During these times, he observed firsthand the private persona behind the public figure. While millions saw the theological brilliance and administrative capabilities of Benedict XVII, Lorenzo witnessed moments of profound humanity. The Pope feeding stray cats behind the Vatican gardens, practicing piano late at night when he thought everyone was asleep, or pausing during his morning walk to help a gardener who had fallen. In 2019, 12 years into Lorenzo's service, Pope Benedict XVII faced the first of several health crises that would ultimately lead to his passing. During an apostolic visit to Ghana, the Pope collapsed from heat exhaustion. Lorenzo, now a lieutenant in the guard, was part of the protective detail. Breaking protocol in that moment, he rushed forward before the medical team, shielding the fallen pontiff from cameras with his own body, creating a momentary sanctuary of dignity. Later, when the Pope had recovered, he requested Lorenzo's presence in his private study, an unprecedented summons for a Swiss guard. "You compromise security protocol today, Lieutenant Bianchi," the Pope said, his voice stern but his eyes kind. Lorenzo stood rigidly at attention. "Yes, Your Holiness, I accept any consequence." "The consequence," Benedict said, his expression softening, "is that I am reminded that while I may be the vicar of Christ, I am still a man, and sometimes I forget that men need not just protection from external threats, but also protection of their dignity." He gestured for Lorenzo to sit, another break in protocol that left the guardsman momentarily paralyzed with uncertainty before carefully taking the offered seat. "Tell me about your father," the Pope said unexpectedly. For nearly an hour, Lorenzo spoke of Marco Bianchi, of his deteriorating health, of his devotion to the church that never wavered even as his body betrayed him. Pope Benedict listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed he remembered details about Marco from decades earlier. As Lorenzo rose to leave, the Pope held out a small wooden rosary. "For your father, tell him an old friend remembers his courage." This moment fundamentally transformed Lorenzo's understanding of his duty. Protection, he realized, went beyond physical security. It extended to protecting the human spirit of the office. Over the next 3 years, as Pope Benedict XVII's health continued to decline, Lorenzo rose to the rank of captain, the youngest in recent Swiss Guard history. His responsibilities expanded, but he always made himself available when the Pope traveled. A quiet understanding existed between them, an unspoken bond forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. In winter of 2023, when Marco Bianchi's condition worsened significantly, Pope Benedict did something that shocked the entire Vatican staff. He made a private visit to the hospital in Lucerne. With minimal security and no media presence, the Pope sat with Lorenzo's father for several hours. No one except Lorenzo and the necessary security detail knew of this visit. What was said between the pontiff and the former guardsman remained between them. But when the Pope emerged from the room, his eyes were red-rimmed. "Your father," he told Lorenzo quietly, "reminded me why I chose my papal name. Benedict means blessed. I came to offer blessing, but instead received one." 2 weeks later, Marco Bianchi passed away. Despite his grueling schedule, Pope Benedict arranged for a personal message to be read at the funeral, an honor typically reserved for high church officials or heads of state. The message spoke not of Marco's service to the papacy, but of his integrity, his faith, and his love for his son. "Some men stand tallest when they kneel in prayer," the Pope's message concluded. Marco Bianchi was such a man. Lorenzo's grief was tempered by profound gratitude. Upon returning to his duties at the Vatican, he found himself guarding a pontiff who was noticeably frilier, who sometimes seemed to disappear into his thoughts during official functions. Concerned whispers circulated among Vatican staff about the Pope's declining health, but official statements remained optimistic. In April 2024, during Easter Mass, observant visitors noticed Pope Benedict XVII struggling to lift the chalice. 2 weeks later, the Vatican announced that the Pope was retreating to Castel Gandolfo for a period of rest and prayer. Lorenzo was among the small security detail assigned to accompany him. At the papal summer residence, freed from the constant demands of Vatican City, Benedict XVII seemed to briefly reclaim some vitality. One evening, he invited Lorenzo to join him for a walk in the gardens, a request so unusual that Lorenzo initially thought he had misheard. As they walked slowly along the garden paths, the Pope reflecting on his life's journey, he occasionally leaned on Lorenzo's arm for support. They paused at a stone bench overlooking Lake Albano, the setting sun gilding the water. "Do you know what I regret, Captain Bianchi?" the Pope asked suddenly. Lorenzo, trained never to engage in personal conversations, remained respectfully silent. I regret the walls, Benedict continued, seemingly unbothered by Lorenzo's silence. Not the physical walls of the Vatican, though they too have their cost. No, I mean the walls of protocol, of tradition, of necessary distance. They protect the office, but they can isolate the man. He looked directly at Lorenzo then. Sometimes I wonder if God sees these elaborate protocols and smiles at our human need for certainty and order. The Pope's health deteriorated rapidly after their return from Castel Gandolfo. By late September, he was unable to stand for long periods, and public appearances were severely curtailed. Lorenzo, now commander of the Pope's personal security detail, found himself spending more time in proximity to Benedict XVII than ever before. On October 12, 2024, Pope Benedict XVII summoned Lorenzo to his private library. The Pope sat in a wheelchair, looking diminished physically but with eyes as alert and penetrating as ever. "Captain Bianchi," he said formally, "I have been considering the security arrangements for the event of my death." Lorenzo tried to object, to steer the conversation to more hopeful territory, but the Pope raised a hand to silence him. "We both know what is coming, my friend. Let us not pretend otherwise." He handed Lorenzo a sealed envelope. "These are my personal instructions regarding certain aspects of my funeral. They do not contradict church protocol, but they add a human element I feel is important." Lorenzo accepted the envelope with a trembling hand. "I will ensure these reach the proper authorities, Your Holiness." "No," the Pope said firmly. "These are for you alone. When the time comes, you will understand." 2 days later, in the pre-dawn hours, Pope Benedict XVII passed away peacefully in his sleep. Lorenzo was among the first notified, rushing to the papal apartments where he found several cardinals already gathered. The machinery of papal transition, procedures refined over centuries, immediately engaged. Lorenzo, despite his senior position, found himself suddenly relegated to ceremonial functions as the Vatican Secretary of State took control of arrangements. The envelope remained in Lorenzo's private quarters, unopened. Something told him the right moment had not yet arrived. The world mourned Pope Benedict XVII. Dignitaries from 156 countries announced their intention to attend the funeral. Security planning became all-consuming, leaving Lorenzo little time to process his own grief. The precise choreography of the papal funeral, a tradition stretching back centuries, occupied every waking moment of Vatican staff. On the morning of the funeral, Lorenzo rose before dawn and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the Pope's personal letterhead. The message was brief, written in Benedict's increasingly shaky handwriting. "Captain Bianchi, when a Swiss guard is interred, his helmet is placed upon his casket as a symbol of his service completed with honor. No such tradition exists for a pope. Perhaps it should. I ask not for myself, but for all who serve behind walls of protocol and formality. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is to remind the world of our shared humanity. With gratitude for your friendship, Benedict XVII." Lorenzo read the words repeatedly, understanding slowly dawning. What the Pope was asking would break 5 centuries of unwavering protocol, could end Lorenzo's career. Yet the request came not as a papal command, but as a final wish from one man to another. As the funeral mass progressed in St. Peter's Basilica, Lorenzo stood at his assigned position, the Pope's letter burning in his mind. The magnificent ceremony unfolded with precision. The incense, the prayers, the solemn music all blending into a tapestry of sacred farewell. When the time came for the casket to be prepared for the procession to the crypt, Lorenzo made his decision. He stepped forward, breaking formation. The cameras that had been broadcasting the ceremony to millions worldwide captured his movement. The other Swiss guards remained in position, though Lorenzo could sense their confusion. His ceremonial halberd dropped to the marble floor with a sound that seemed to pierce the solemn silence of the basilica. Lorenzo approached the Pope's casket, heart pounding so loudly he was certain others could hear it. With hands he forced to remain steady, he removed his helmet, an action strictly forbidden while on duty. an action that in 5 centuries of Swiss Guard tradition had never been performed in the presence of a papal casket. Lorenzo gently placed his helmet on Pope Benedict XVII casket. The red plume lay against the dark wood, the gold emblem of the Guard catching the light from the basilica's windows. Then, in a final gesture that sent shockwaves through the assembled dignitaries and millions watching worldwide, Lorenzo pressed his forehead against the casket and whispered, "Goodbye, my friend." Cardinal Rossi, the Camerlengo responsible for funeral proceedings, moved forward as if to intervene, then stopped. Something in Lorenzo's posture, in the profound silence that had fallen over the usually bustling basilica, made even the strict guardians of Vatican protocol hesitate. As Lorenzo stepped back, he was certain his career was over. He expected to be immediately removed, perhaps even arrested for his breach. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Cardinal Keller, the dean of the College of Cardinals and a man known for his rigid adherence to tradition, slowly removed his scarlet zucchetto and placed it beside Lorenzo's helmet on the casket. Then Cardinal Juan, tears streaming openly down his face, added his pectoral cross. One by one, representatives from different faiths, dignitaries from nations often at odds, approached to add small personal tokens to the papal casket. A flower, a prayer card, a military medal, a simple written note. What had begun as a breach of protocol transformed into a spontaneous outpouring of human connection that transcended religious and political boundaries. The carefully planned ceremony yielded to a moment of genuine, unscripted farewell that resonated with millions watching around the world. When Lorenzo returned to his position, expecting censure from his commander, he instead received a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Later, Lorenzo would learn that his commander had received the same letter from Pope Benedict XVII, with instructions to allow what might unfold. In the days following the funeral, Lorenzo's action became the subject of intense debate within Vatican circles and beyond. Traditional Catholics condemned the breach of protocol as disrespectful. Others saw it as a powerful reminder of the humanity at the heart of faith. Editorials around the world used the moment as a springboard to discuss the tension between tradition and authentic human connection. Lorenzo himself was summoned to meet with the Cardinal Secretary of State, widely considered the second most powerful man in the Vatican. Entering the ornate office, Lorenzo was prepared for dismissal. "Captain Bianchi," the cardinal began, his expression unreadable. "What you did was unprecedented." "Yes, Your Eminence," Lorenzo replied, standing at attention. "I take full responsibility." The cardinal studied him for a long moment. "Do you know what Pope Benedict XVII said to me about you 3 weeks before his passing?" He said, "Watch Captain Bianchi. He understands something many of us forget, that beneath our offices and titles, God sees only our hearts." The cardinal rose and walked to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. "The College of Cardinals begins conclave tomorrow to elect our new pope. There are those who feel your action merits dismissal. Others believe it represents exactly the spirit of renewal our church needs in these times." He turned back to face Lorenzo. "I'm assigning you to lead security for the conclave. When the new pope emerges, your future will be in his hands." The conclave lasted 5 days, longer than most Vatican observers had predicted. When white smoke finally rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, Lorenzo stood at his position on the balcony where the new pontiff would soon appear to greet the world. Cardinal Rossi, the same man who had nearly intervened during Lorenzo's breach of protocol, emerged as Pope Leo XIV. His first act was surprising. Rather than delivering the traditional first blessing, he asked for a moment of silence to honor his predecessor. That evening, Lorenzo was once again summoned, this time to meet with the new pope. As he entered the papal study, Lorenzo was struck by how different it felt. Where Pope Benedict XVII had surrounded himself with books and simple furnishings, Pope Leo had already transformed the space with art and technology that reflected his reputation as a modernizer. "Captain Bianchi," the new pope greeted him warmly. "I've spent much of my first day reviewing your file. Impressive service record." "Thank you, Your Holiness," Lorenzo responded, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "And of course, there's the matter of the funeral." Pope Leo leaned forward, hands clasped. "You realize that for 500 years, No Swiss guard has ever broken ranks during a papal ceremony. Lorenzo stood straighter. Yes, Your Holiness. Benedict and I often disagreed on matters of church governance. Pope Leo continued, surprising Lorenzo with his frankness. But we agreed completely on one thing. The church must balance tradition with authentic witness to remain relevant in today's world. He smiled slightly. Your action at the funeral has generated more positive discussion about the papacy among young people than a dozen encyclicals might have achieved. Lorenzo remained silent, processing this unexpected perspective. I'm instituting a new tradition, the Pope announced. Future papal funerals will include a moment when the commanding Swiss guard places his helmet on the casket, symbolizing the guard's final protection of the pontiff. He paused. What was once a breach becomes tomorrow's tradition. That's how the church has always evolved, hasn't it? Relief washed over Lorenzo, followed quickly by a deeper realization. His impulsive act of loyalty and friendship had somehow become a bridge between tradition and renewal. There's something else, Pope Leo added. Benedict left a letter to be opened by his successor. In it, he specifically requested that you be permitted to visit his tomb privately, without the usual restrictions. That's most unusual, Captain Bianchi. You must have made quite an impression on a man not known for close personal relationships. The following morning, before the Vatican opened to the public, Lorenzo descended alone to the papal crypts beneath St. Peter's Basilica. In the hushed silence of the sacred space, he made his way to the simple marble slab marking Pope Benedict XVII's final resting place. Lorenzo stood at attention for a long moment, then knelt beside the tomb. From his pocket, he withdrew two items. A small, worn wooden rosary, the one Benedict had given Lorenzo to pass to his father, but which Marco had insisted be returned to the Pope upon his own death, and a photograph of Lorenzo's father in his Swiss Guard uniform from decades earlier. He placed both items in a small niche beside the tomb, then rested his hand on the coal marble. You once told me that God sees beyond our protocols and traditions, Lorenzo whispered. I believe you now see as God sees. He paused, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Thank you for showing me that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to break tradition. As Lorenzo rose and turned to leave, he noticed something he had missed upon entering. His helmet, the one he had placed on the Pope's casket, now rested on a small pedestal beside the tomb. Not a temporary placement, but carefully mounted on a permanent marble base with a small bronze plaque. Stepping closer, he read the inscription. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. John 15 verse 13. Lorenzo stood motionless, understanding the profound message. Pope Benedict XVII had recognized that sometimes protection meant more than physical security. Sometimes it meant protecting one's humanity, dignity, and spirit. In placing his helmet on the casket, Lorenzo had symbolically laid down not his physical life, but his career, his reputation, his future, all to honor a final request from a man who had become more than just his pope. As Lorenzo ascended the stairs back to the basilica, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the vast space with a golden glow. A small group of tourists had already gathered, some pointing curiously at the Swiss guards in their distinctive uniforms. Among them, Lorenzo noticed a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, watching the guards with the same wide-eyed fascination Lorenzo had felt decades earlier. The boy's father bent down, explaining something about the Swiss guards' history. Lorenzo approached them, breaking his stern demeanor for a moment. Would you like to try on a beret? He asked the startled boy, removing his own non-ceremonial headgear. As the child cautiously accepted the beret, his face lighting up with delight, Lorenzo caught the grateful smile of the father. In that simple human connection, beyond protocol, beyond tradition, Lorenzo felt the presence of two fathers watching with approval. His own, and a pope who had understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies in allowing oneself to be simply human. Outside the Vatican walls, media outlets continued to analyze the helmet incident as it had come to be known. Theologians debated its significance, security experts questioned its propriety, and Vatican officials crafted careful statements balancing respect for tradition with acknowledgement of its emotional impact. But within those walls, A single act of devotion that transcended protocol had changed something fundamental. Visitors to Pope Benedict XVII's tomb would forever see the Swiss Guard helmet mounted nearby and learn the story of a guard who understood that true protection encompasses not just the body, but the human spirit. And in the years that followed, whenever asked about that day, Lorenzo would simply say, "I did what friendship required." For in that moment when protocol yielded to compassion, when tradition bowed to human connection, the Swiss Guard had offered not just a final salute, but a reminder that beneath all our roles and responsibilities, we remain beautifully, vulnerably human.